Eulogy, Chapter 2. My flight was unexceptional, as was my anxiety, for which I had the usual, half of a Xanax and a string of slow abdominal Zen breaths. Notwithstanding, I despised flying, could never work, could never really relax, much less sleep, and sometimes, days like this one especially, uncomfortable ones aloft, I couldn't seem to shake the inkling that things were coming to some sort of rough head, and not just with my mother. Twisting away from the bulging, wheezing man in the seat next to me, I watched as the river-beribboned coast of Virginia passed some 30,000 feet beneath me. Empty of thought, numb of feeling. That, too, seemed about par for me these days. Though, to be able to forget, this morning's set to with Nina, the inevitable flare-ups at work, the past, it is a certain sort of freedom. I'm 38 and I have no life. That's probably a bit of overkill, but it is fair to say mine is certainly not an examined life. After all, I'm a lawyer. I made partner at Stone Collins in Paris 2 years ago, and I've been married to the same woman for 10. We have a one-bedroom on the Upper East Side. We are childless and prefer to keep it that way. Looking at it from the outside, I suppose that sounds like a pretty good deal. American dream type of stuff, especially given where I came from. But that's not the way it feels. Though I'm a very private person, my time is never my own. I spend my days parceling out my life to others, strangers really, in 6-minute increments. In the trade, it's called the billable hour, the lawyer's sole unit of production, of which, no matter how you shake it, there are only a finite number. A manufacturer can always ramp up production and make more widgets, or a manager can always leverage his sales force by bringing in new underlings. For my ilk, however, there are only so many minutes in a day, and every one of them has to be accounted for and entered into a database to be considered productive, meaningful. It feels like that ought to be a metaphor for something, but for the life of me, I can't think of anything. I take some small comfort in the fact that my time has a quantifiable market value. I'm a corporate litigator, an advocate, a hired gun, a corporate whore, a capitalist tool. Only time that I spend doing something on behalf of, importantly, a paying client can be billed out. Lunches generally don't count, though as a rule I tend to work through both lunch and dinner. Nor do bathroom breaks or gabbing in the hallways or checking the Dow or the previous evening's scores. Time spent doing administrative tasks or futzing with my computer or negotiating office politics cannot be charged. I can't even bill for continuing education or reading crucial Supreme Court cases when they come down, unless they are directly relevant to an ongoing matter. For every 10 billable hours, I might wind up spending 15 or 20 or even more at the office. To ascend the ladder at my firm, and it's like this at most large firms, you are required to bill a minimum of 2,000 hours a year. Minimum. When you do the math, that means you have to spend at least 3,000 hours at work. Give yourself 2 weeks for vacation and holidays, which I almost never have the opportunity to take. And that means to achieve minimal success at this level, you have to be at work an average of 60 hours a week. My biggest year, the year before I made partner, I billed 3,200 hours. I have no idea how many hours I spent at the office, but it felt like a lifetime. I didn't have a day off the whole year, except for Thanksgiving, which I spent with Nina. We both slept the whole day and ate sliced turkey sandwiches from the deli. I shouldn't complain, though I do sometimes when I have downtime, like now. It takes my mind off my anxiety about flying. I'm very well compensated for my time. What's more, I don't have to feel ashamed to tell people what I do. I'm on the verge of the highest level in my prestigious profession, equity partner. All I have to do is nurture client relations, maybe bring in a new account. They say the grind eases up at some point. but you couldn't prove it by me. One thing I will say about my job, it isn't life and death. I don't handle criminal cases or family matters, nor am I an ambulance chaser. Emotionally speaking, the stakes in those areas are too high. Those are the guys who tend to burn out the quickest. The urgency at my job is mostly about money, business matters. Still, I've known plenty of broken men, and lately even some women, whose increasingly requited quest for workplace equality has brought them unanticipated unhappinesses. Ugly divorces, broken families, sudden heart attacks, crippling strokes, autoimmune disorders, breakdowns, despair, even suicides. And that's just my floor at the firm. I don't know what I was expecting when I chose this profession and this city. Maybe the glamour of L.A. law, or the thrills of a John Grisham novel, or the enticements of Wall Street the movie. The sort of brass ring society paraded in front of those of us who came of age in the 80s. But the fact is, the law is a soul-crushing profession. I take full responsibility for my choices. The worst I can say for myself is that I'm chronically exhausted, and my marriage could be better. Naturally, the two are related. Most of the time I spend away from the office, I'm either asleep or trying to get there. A problem I could probably minimize somewhat if I could figure out how to sleep on an airplane and forget about exercising. Nina's a pretty good sport about all this, or at least she seems to be. Growing up the daughter of Brad Chilton, my sponsor and mentor and senior partner at Stone Collins, she wasn't naive. She knew what she was getting into when she married me. She had seen firsthand how her father's work life took him away from her and Sarah. I suppose there's what's ideal and what you're comfortable with. Then again, she's always been fairly independent. She has her own life with its own demands. We are alike in that regard. She writes, directs, and mainly produces off-Broadway plays, one-person shows, and experimental performance pieces. Her downtown company, Gambling with Your Life, is her outlet. She's obsessed with it, even though it always seems to be teetering on the edge of failure. One unsuccessful run or one failed grant away from shuttering. I can't say how many times we've scrambled to rescue it, or how much of my own salary I've sunk into trying to keep it afloat, or even how much pro bono, i.e. non-billable legal time, I've devoted to it. Bottom line, she does what she does and I do what I do. And though our energies pull us in different directions, at the end of a long, draining day, we can still collapse together. Comfortably for at least part of the night. And if we have any energy left over for each other, all the better. The sky today was brilliant and thin. Aided by an unusual southerly tailwind, the plane landed early. Even so, my father was already at the small North Carolina airport, sitting off by himself and staring into the distance. An unexpected old man. His hair was now serenely white. He seemed smaller somehow. For some reason this shook me, though it shouldn't have. He was breaching his 70s. Had I really not seen him since my wedding? These affairs were always fraught with their small slights and insults, but people, families, supposedly got over them. Somehow ours hadn't. I don't think anyone at the time expected it would be 10 years before I would see my parents again. They didn't like to travel. I had my life with Nina and the demands of my job. The years and the excuses had piled up. A bout of flu, a slipped disc, a business trip, a deadline, social obligations. 9/11 had merited merely a couple of tentative, worried phone calls. Pretty soon, a decade had passed, and I had managed to leave my parents, and with them my past, behind. My father looked uncomfortable in a checkered flannel shirt, tucked halfway into his high-waisted jeans. He wore the same dress black loafers he always wore in the pulpit. In his lap he cradled a steel thermos the size of an artillery shell. He seemed to be looking right at me, but showed no sign of recognition. It reminded me of being a child, trying to slink down in the wooden pew as his eyes would search me out and settle right in on mine at some emphatic point in his sermon. one most likely aimed at me for some indiscretion I no doubt had committed during the week. I nodded to him and waved. He squinted in my direction, then creaked to his feet and attempted a smile when I reached the top of the ramp. He extended his right hand, a move he had perfected over a lifetime of Sundays. I took it, then pulled him toward me. He stumbled into my awkward embrace, not sure, I suspect, what to do with the canister in his free hand. I braced against his weight and clapped him on the back, almost apologetically. A bro hug being the most I could manage. He heaved a surprised sigh in my ear as if I had squeezed the breath from his lungs. Several professional types huffed around us. He said he'd been at the terminal for a while, having forgotten what time Abby had told him my plane was to land. He hadn't slept much the night before, but then again, he hardly ever slept much these days. The parking lot was oddly quiet, unlike the LaGuardias and JFKs and Newarks to which I was so used. Empty spots everywhere. Still, he had parked off a great distance from the terminal doors, poised, I suspect, for ease of exit. "Here, I'll drive," I said when we finally reached his car, a Taurus of dulled paint and uncertain vintage. "I don't get the chance much in Manhattan." It might have been the same one he was driving the last time I'd been home. He conceded the keys. "Don't you have any baggage?" "I've got a change of underwear in my briefcase. I have to fly back early in the morning. I've got a conference in federal court tomorrow afternoon I couldn't get out of." He stared straight ahead. "You didn't have to come," he said. I wasn't sure it was quite what he meant. "I know, Dad. It's been too long. I'm just sorry it had to be under these circumstances." "Well, you always knew what you wanted." I didn't know what else to say to this stranger, my father. I never knew him to resort to irony, but it wasn't until he said this that I realized just how wrong he was about me. Maybe that's the way I came across to my parents. It wasn't the way I felt. I only wanted to get away from their small-town life and get on with my own. If there was anyone who always knew what she wanted, it was Nina. It was what first drew me to her. I drove the back way from the airport, a route he showed me. I tried to avoid the expressway, he said. Traffic's so much worse anymore. It took us on country roads that rolled out like ribbons past terraced pastures of tall grasses, past white plank farmhouses and shuttered gas stations, past open sheds of rotting timbers and rusted tin roofs, past bulldozed subdivision and condominium sites and new, hastily built strip malls and office parks. What stands of trees remained blazed in brilliant autumn hues, ginkgo yellow, maple red, pine green, as the silver light of the low sun leached a long season's life from their limbs. It was a world I remembered, but one in which I no longer belonged. I gave him broad, upbeat outlines of my life in New York. Nina, my job. Not lies, really, just not the whole truth. The pace, the pressure, the tension, the chronic exhaustion. He seemed to listen, but didn't speak much. Then again, he never did, unless they were God's words. My parents lived in a plat of 60s-era split-level tract houses, set back from the main strip of fast food franchises and chain stores that had grown up around them by a narrow road that wound across a creek and through a corridor of forested bottomland. I seem to recall a rafter of wild turkeys had roved these woods at one time. You often saw them picking their way along the roadside, early in the mornings or late afternoons. They were nowhere to be seen. Of course, this was November. And this was my mother. "She isn't talking much, son. She can't seem to fight her way through the medication, the morphine and whatnot. It's smothering her mind. When she wants to say something, she has to plan ahead and stop her drip," he said as I turned onto his short street. "She can't speak unless she's in pain." His face fell in heavy folds from his sun-freckled skull, as though he had lost the will to keep it from sagging. There was a spot, a whitish scar just above what was left of his hairline. It looked like he had had something removed, melanoma perhaps. His eyes, Small, dark coals, set in bruised circles, no longer sparkled. His puffy eyelids were threatening to close over them. His hair, contrary, wispy, and white, made to fly away, grew unkempt from his ears. His nostrils, Hal's he had a pained look on his face. Nina? I had just been talking about her. Yes, Nina. She's fine, Dad. Like I said. Saturday is the opening night of this piece she's producing. Artsy kind of thing. Lots of last-minute details. She just couldn't pull herself away. He drifted into a silent space. You look tired. This thing with Mom seems to be taking its toll on you. She doesn't have long, son. She'll be glad you came.